My name is Nessie. For 5 years, I believed I was a wife, a partner, and a daughter-in-law. I poured my heart into a home that was never meant to be mine, only to realize I was nothing more than a pawn in a game I didn't even know was being played. The night of my 5th anniversary, a night that should have been filled with love, I was branded a thief, slapped by the woman I called mother, and looked at with cold disgust by the man I once worshipped. I was cast out into a freezing storm with nothing but a single suitcase and a shattered soul. They didn't just take my home, they tried to take my humanity. They thought that by throwing me into the dirt, I would simply disappear, but they forgot that a seed only grows when it is buried. If you have ever felt the sting of betrayal, or if you are currently standing in the middle of your own storm, I want you to know that you are not alone. Your worth is not defined by the lies told about you, but by the strength you find to rise again. I invite you to walk this path of healing and justice with me. Please, consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. This isn't just a channel, it's a sanctuary for every soul that has been told they aren't enough, and a reminder that the most elegant response to cruelty is to live a life so beautiful it becomes your greatest victory. Subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Let us find our crowns, together. The air in the grand dining room of the Sterling estate was thick with the scent of white lilies and the metallic tang of expensive silverware, a fragrance I had spent 5 years learning to curate. It was our 5th anniversary, a milestone that, in the rarefied circles Julian navigated, signaled a marriage's transition from a youthful venture to a permanent institution. I had meticulously orchestrated every detail, from the hand-calligraphed menus to the vintage Bordeaux breathing in its crystal decanter. The candlelight flickered against the mahogany table, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the room. I sat across from Julian, wearing a dress the color of bruised plums, feeling the weight of the silence that had slowly become the primary tenant of our home. I looked at my husband, tracing the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw, waiting for a glimmer of the man who had once promised to protect me from the world's jagged edges. But Julian's eyes were like obsidian, dark, polished, and utterly impenetrable. The dinner had proceeded with a haunting, rhythmic precision until the heavy oak doors swung open with a violence that extinguished the serenity I had worked so hard to maintain. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, entered not as a guest, but as a predator scenting blood in the wind. Her presence was a cold front, chilling the warmth of the room instantly. She did not offer a greeting, she offered a scream, a jagged laceration of the evening's carefully constructed peace. She claimed her heirloom diamond necklace, a piece of history valued at $500,000, had vanished from her private safe. Her voice, usually a practiced contralto of high society elegance, was now a shrill weapon, vibrating with a vitriol directed solely at me. I felt the first prickle of dread, a cold sweat blooming along my spine as she stood there, her diamonds flashing like warning lights, accusing me of a transgression that felt as alien as it was impossible. I turned to Julian, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I expected a rebuttal, a shield, or at the very least, a look of shared confusion. Instead, I found a stranger. The man who shared my bed and my secrets did not rise to my defense. He did not question the absurdity of the claim or the timing of the intrusion. He sat perfectly still, his wine glass poised midway to his lips, watching me with a calculated, clinical disgust that was more painful than any physical blow. It was a gaze that didn't seek the truth, it had already rendered a verdict. In that moment, the lavish room felt like a gilded cage, and the realization began to dawn on me that this anniversary was not a celebration of our union, but the commencement of my execution. Beatrice's accusations spiraled into a choreographed frenzy, her words painting me as a common thief, a social climber who had finally succumbed to the greed inherent in my lowly bloodline. She spoke of the necklace not just as jewelry, but as a sacred relic I had defiled. I tried to find my voice, to navigate the suffocating tide of her insults, but Julian finally spoke, and his words were the heavy stones that sank my hope. He didn't ask me if I had done it, he simply stated that my recent erratic behavior and my supposed dissatisfaction with our lifestyle had made such a desperate act plausible. The betrayal was visceral, a sharp blade twisting in the soft tissue of my trust. He looked at me as if I were a smudge on a pristine canvas, a mistake he was finally ready to erase. The air grew thin as Julian rose from the table, his movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. He didn't look at me as he suggested that the only way to clear the air, or rather, to confirm the inevitable, was a search of my most private sanctuary. He demanded to inspect my vanity, the small, ornate desk where I kept my journals, my grandmother's simple gold bands, and the few remnants of the woman I was before I became Mrs. Sterling. It was a demand for total desecration. As we climbed the marble staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoed like a funeral march. Beatrice followed, her face a mask of triumphant malice, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of my ruin. Entering our bedroom felt like entering a courtroom where the judge and prosecutor were one and the same. The room was a masterpiece of interior design, serene, ivory, and cold. Julian walked toward my vanity with a purposeful stride, his shadow stretching across the silk wallpaper like a shroud. I stood by the door, my hands trembling, my mind a fractured mosaic of memories and mounting terror. I realized then that the perfection of our life had been a meticulously maintained facade, a stage set for this very moment of public and private annihilation. The silence was no longer empty, it was pregnant with the weight of a trap that had been years in the making, and as Julian reached for the drawer of my vanity, I felt the final, fragile threads of my old life begin to snap one by one. The brutality of his search was not in the physical mess he made, but in the clinical coldness with which he handled my belongings. He tossed aside my silk scarves and scattered my modest collection of perfumes as if they were trash. Every movement was a proclamation of my worthlessness in his eyes. He didn't find the necklace in the first drawer, nor the second, but his resolve did not waver. It was the absolute certainty in his posture that terrified me the most. He wasn't searching for the necklace, he was waiting for it to appear. I watched, paralyzed, as the man I loved became the architect of my destruction, his every gesture a calculated stroke and a masterpiece of betrayal. The anniversary candles downstairs would still be burning, casting light on an empty table, while up here, in the dark heart of our home, the life I had built was being systematically dismantled by the hands that had once held mine. As Julian's fingers brushed the velvet lining of my jewelry box, I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in his judgment. This was a liberation for him and a life sentence for me. The cruelty was refined, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting a world where I was never truly a wife, but merely a temporary occupant of a role that had now reached its expiration date. I stood in the doorway of my own desecrated sanctuary, a ghost in a plum-colored dress, watching the two people who were supposed to be my family prepare the final blow that would leave me with nothing but the bitter, cold truth of my own expendability. The bedroom, once a sanctuary of soft linens and whispered promises, had been transformed into a cold, brightly lit stage for my public evisceration. Julian's hands, usually so precise and deliberate, moved with a predatory grace toward the back of my vanity. He reached for a small, sapphire blue velvet box, a relic of my life before the sterling name had swallowed me whole. It was an object I never touched, a container for memories of a family that possessed nothing but integrity, tucked away in a corner of the drawer I hadn't opened in years. The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning into a heavy, suffocating fog as his fingers brushed the fabric. I wanted to scream, to tell him that the box was empty, a hollow shell of my former self, but my throat felt as though it had been filled with shards of glass. With a flick of his wrist, Julian flipped the lid open. The overhead chandelier, a monstrosity of tiered crystal, caught the sudden explosion of light from within. There, nestled against the worn blue velvet like a coiled serpent, lay the heirloom necklace. Its diamonds were blinding, mocking the dimness of my hope with their cold, fire-filled brilliance. The sight was a physical blow, a rupture in reality that left me gasping for air that wouldn't come. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even seen the safe it allegedly came from in months. Yet, there it was, radiating a silent, damning testimony against me. The silence that followed was not empty, it was a living thing, a predatory beast that feasted on the remnants of my dignity. Beatrice moved first. Her reaction was a masterclass in staged indignation, a performance honed by decades of social maneuvering. She didn't just take the necklace, she snatched it with a guttural sound of triumph that she masqueraded as grief. Then came the strike. Her hand, adorned with rings that felt like brass knuckles, collided with my cheek. The sound was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed off the minimalist walls, a percussion of pure hatred. My head snapped back, the world spinning into a blurred mosaic of ivory and gold. My skin burned, not just from the impact, but from the searing realization that the domestic staff, the maids and the butler I had treated with nothing but kindness, stood gathered at the threshold of the room, their faces masks of pity and morbid curiosity. I was no longer the mistress of the house, I was a specimen under a microscope, a lowborn parasite finally caught in the act of feeding. Beatrice's voice was a jagged blade, slicing through the ringing in my ears. She spat the words with a vituperation that felt like venom, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying joy. She spoke of my lineage as if it were a disease, a stain that no amount of sterling wealth could ever hope to wash away. I looked at the staff, searching for a single pair of eyes that held a flicker of doubt, but they looked away, their loyalty bought or their fear entrenched. I was alone in a room full of people who had already decided I was a ghost. My cheek throbbed with a rhythmic heat, a physical manifestation of the shame they were branding into my soul. Then Julian spoke, and his voice was the true death knell. It wasn't the roar of a husband betrayed, it was the calm, measured tone of a man who had finally finished a tedious chore. He didn't look at me with anger. Anger would have implied a remnant of passion, a spark of the love that had once supposedly burned between us. Instead, he looked at me with a chillingly calm, clinical detachment. He adjusted his cuffs, his gaze lingering on the necklace now clutched in his mother's trembling hand. He murmured that he had long suspected my greed, that my humble origins had left a vacuum in my soul that only larceny could fill. He called it a crime, not a mistake, framing my entire existence within these walls as a long-term heist. His words were the final stones being laid over my grave. The emotional blow was a slow-motion car crash, every detail vivid and agonizing. As I looked from the necklace to my husband's frozen, handsome face, the pieces of the last few months began to click into place with a sickening precision. The sudden coldness, the way he had encouraged me to handle more of the household's administrative duties, the way Beatrice had insisted on moving her safe into the wing closest to my dressing room, it wasn't a series of coincidences. It was a choreography. This was an execution, planned with the same meticulous attention to detail as the anniversary dinner I had prepared downstairs. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted me destroyed, stripped of my legal rights, my reputation, and my very humanity. They needed a villain to justify the divorce they had already drafted in their minds. I felt a strange, icy clarity wash over me, a stillness that comes when the worst has already happened. I was standing in the center of a trap I had helped build with my own compliance. The realization that my marriage had been a theater of cruelty, a 5-year rehearsal for this single night of ruin, was more painful than Beatrice's slap or Julian's condemnation. I was a pawn in a game played by monsters who wore silk and spoke in modulated tones. The legal fallout would be swift, I could see it in the way Julian's hand moved toward his phone, likely already dialing the family's high-priced attorneys to ensure I wouldn't leave with a single cent, or my freedom. I stood there, my face burning and my heart a hollow chamber of ice, watching them celebrate my fall. They were already moving past me, discussing the legalities and the scandal management as if I were a piece of furniture that had finally broken beyond repair. The domestic staff dispersed like shadows at dawn, leaving me in the wreckage of my life. I realized then that the woman who had walked into this room, the hopeful, desperate to please Lorena, was dead. In her place was something new, something forged in the heat of this betrayal. I looked at the velvet box, still lying open on the floor like a gaping wound, and I made a silent vow. If they wanted a crime, I would give them a reckoning. If they wanted a thief, I would steal back the life they thought they had already buried. The library of the Sterling estate, usually a sanctuary of leather-bound wisdom and quiet contemplation, had been repurposed into a theater of clinical cruelty. The heavy mahogany doors remained closed, sealing the three of us inside an atmosphere so thick with malice it felt like breathing silt. Julian sat behind his father's immense desk, a throne of dark wood that lent him a judicial gravity he hadn't earned but was now wielding with terrifying precision. Beatrice stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp against the dying embers, her presence a silent, gloating sentinel. This was not a conversation, it was an inquisition, a kangaroo court where the verdict had been etched in stone long before the first accusation was leveled. Julian did not shout. His voice was a low, melodic vibration that felt more dangerous than any scream. He laid a stack of documents on the desk, thick, ivory parchment that shimmered under the green glow of the banker's lamp. He spoke of my transgression as a foregone conclusion, a stain on the sterling legacy that required immediate and total excision. There was a sickening elegance to his sadism. He offered me a choice that was no choice at all, an ultimatum designed to strip me of my past, my present, and any hope of a future. I was to sign the divorce papers, acknowledging my fault and waiving every cent of alimony, or he would personally hand the CCTV evidence and the recovered necklace to the district attorney. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of my life in a state penitentiary, a place where women like me were broken until nothing remained. The psychological weight of his words was meant to crush my spirit into a fine powder. He detailed the loss of my reputation, the public shaming of my family back home, and the absolute certainty of my conviction. He spoke with a detached, professional air, as if he were negotiating a corporate merger rather than the destruction of his wife's soul. Every sentence was a calculated strike at my insecurities, a reminder that without the sterling name, I was a ghost, unseen, unheard, and utterly expendable. I looked at the man I had once believed was my partner, and I saw only the cold, hard gears of a machine that had finally decided I was a faulty part. Just as the silence threatened to swallow me whole, Julian delivered the final, jagged twist. He pressed a button on the intercom, and the library door creaked open to admit Maria, the young maid I had once helped with her mother's medical bills. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the patterned Persian rug, her hands trembling as she recited a rehearsed testimony. She claimed she had seen me slipping into Beatrice's suite during the anniversary preparations, her voice a fragile reed of lies bought with sterling gold. The betrayal was visceral, a physical ache that radiated from my chest to my fingertips. They hadn't just framed me, they had corrupted the few alliances I thought I had, ensuring that even the truth would have no witnesses. Beatrice stepped forward then, her face illuminated by the lamp's sickly light. With a predatory grace, she demanded my belongings. It was a symbolic disarming. She reached for my handbag, her fingers like talons as she extracted my phone, my only connection to the outside world, and my car keys. I watched as she placed them on the desk beside Julian, a trophy of my total sequestration. I was being severed from the world, my identity liquidated in a matter of minutes. I was now a prisoner within the very walls I had decorated, a woman stripped of her voice and her agency, trapped in a nightmare orchestrated by the people who were supposed to be my kin. The room felt smaller, the walls of books closing in like the bars of a cage. Julian pushed the fountain pen toward me, its gold nib glinting like a needle. He told me I had until dawn to decide, the quiet poverty of a signed confession or the loud, brutal reality of a jail cell. There was no room for negotiation, no space for the truth to breathe. I stood there, my hands clasped tight to hide their shaking, realizing that the perfection of my marriage had been a long-form deception, a gilded trap that had finally snapped shut. Yet, in the deepest hollow of my despair, a cold, hard ember of defiance began to glow. They had taken my jewelry, my reputation, and my keys, but they had underestimated the clarity that comes with total loss. As I stared at the documents that were meant to be my death warrant, I realized that for them to want me this gone, there had to be something they were still afraid of. I wasn't just a nuisance to be discarded, I was a witness they needed to silence. The silence of the library was no longer just a wait, it was a space in which I could begin to plot my own resurrection. I would not sign tonight. I would wait for the shadows to shift. The sky over the Sterling estate had finally buckled, unleashing a torrential downpour that felt less like weather and more like a celestial cleansing. The rain was a relentless, percussive force, drumming against the slate roof and drowning out the echoes of my own footsteps as I was escorted to the grand entrance. Julian did not look at me as he pushed the heavy mahogany door shut, the click of the lock resonating with a finality that severed my soul from the only life I had known for 5 years. I stood on the porch, clutching the handle of a single, battered suitcase, a paltry sum of a decade's worth of devotion, as the wind whipped my plum-colored dress around my shivering frame. I was a discard, a broken ornament being tossed into the gutter before the morning light could reveal the cracks. The walk down the long, winding driveway felt like an odyssey through a watery purgatory. The gravel crunched beneath my thin evening shoes, each step a reminder of the treacherous terrain I had navigated blindly for so long. The mansion loomed behind me, a dark, monolithic tomb of secrets, its windows glowing with a warmth that was no longer mine to share. I reached the towering iron gates, the cold metal biting into my palms as I struggled to push them open. I was wet to the bone, the freezing rain numbing my skin but sharpening the jagged edges of my thoughts. I was Alara, the thief, Alara, the parasite, Alara, the ghost of a woman who had once believed in the sanctity of a vow. As I stepped onto the rain-slicked pavement of the main road, a pair of searing white headlights cut through the gloom, blinding me. A sleek, silver Continental, a car far too expensive for the hour, purred toward the gates I had just exited. It slowed to a crawl beside me, the window gliding down with a soft, mechanical hiss that mocked the chaos of the storm. Inside, bathed in the soft amber glow of the dashboard, sat Isabel. She was Julian's ex-girlfriend, the woman whose ghost had haunted the periphery of my marriage, the one Beatrice had always whispered about with a wistful, pointed longing. She looked at me not with pity, but with a terrifying, serene triumph. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her silk scarf a vibrant contrast to the gray desolation of the night. She didn't speak, she simply offered a slow, feline smile that communicated everything Julian's silence had omitted. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a replacement. The theft of the necklace hadn't been an act of desperation on my part, but a clearing of the stage for her grand re-entrance. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless in the middle of the deluge. I was the inconvenient wife, the placeholder who had been framed not because of greed, but because I had outlived my utility in their grand, dynastic design. The car surged forward, the gates swinging open automatically to welcome the new queen as they had just expelled the old. I watched her taillights vanish into the mist, the red glow reflecting in the puddles like pools of fresh blood. The betrayal was now complete, a perfect circle of malice that left me standing in the mud with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that felt like it had been pulverized by a velvet-gloved fist. For a moment, the weight of the rain seemed heavy enough to drive me into the earth, to bury me where I stood. But as I turned away from the gates, a sudden, electric jolt of memory flickered through the darkness of my mind. It was a memory of a small, inconspicuous object, a vintage-style teddy bear I had placed on the bookshelf in Beatrice's private sitting room months ago. At the time, I had told myself it was a whimsical gift to soften her sharp edges, but in reality, it was a vessel for my own quiet paranoia. After a series of unexplained disappearances of household supplies and whispers of staff negligence, I had installed a high-definition nanny cam within the bear's glass eyes. It was a sophisticated piece of smart home security, linked to a private cloud server that only I could access. A cold, sharp laugh bubbled up in my throat, swallowed instantly by the wind. In their haste to strip me of my phone, my keys, and my dignity, they had forgotten the very thing that made me a sterling, my obsession with the meticulous management of our home. They saw me as a simpleton, a girl from the provinces who was lucky to be there, never realizing that I was the one who had digitized the estate's security infrastructure. I had been the architect of the invisible threads that bound the house together. The cloud server didn't require my physical phone, it required my mind, my passwords, and any device with an internet connection. The evidence they had used to condemn me, the staged entry into the room, the planted necklace, was likely captured from an angle they hadn't even considered. My despair began to transmute into something harder, something crystalline and dangerous. The rain no longer felt like a shroud, it felt like a baptism. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, my knuckles white, and began to walk toward the distant lights of the city. I was no longer a victim fleeing a crime scene. I was a hunter who had just remembered where the traps were hidden. The transition from a mansion of marble to a studio apartment that smelled of damp plaster and scorched coffee was not a descent, it was a distillation. My new world was measured in square inches, a cramped sanctuary located in a part of the city where the neon lights of a 24-hour laundromat served as my only chandelier. The walls were thin enough to hear the rhythmic ticking of a neighbor's clock, a constant reminder that time was moving, even if my life seemed to have stalled in a state of gritty, urban purgatory. I worked 2 jobs, scrubbing floors in a commercial office block by dawn and filing dusty records for a legal aid clinic by night. My hands, once manicured and soft, grew calloused and stained with ink and lye, physical manifestations of my shedding of the sterling skin. In the silence of those exhausted midnights, a profound internal shift occurred. The tears that had threatened to drown me on the night of the storm had dried, leaving behind a sediment of cold, hard resolve. I realized that my social annihilation was, in fact, my greatest tactical advantage. To Julian and Beatrice, I was dead, a ghost consigned to the shadows of the lower class they so thoroughly despised. In their arrogance, they assumed I would simply dissipate, a puff of smoke in the wind of their prosperity. They did not realize that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature in existence. I was no longer Alara the wife, I was an anonymous observer, a specter haunting the periphery of their gilded world. I spent my few free hours in the public library, submerged in the labyrinthine world of contract law and criminal jurisprudence. I studied the mechanics of their world, the way assets were shielded, the way reputations were litigated, and the precise legal definitions of conspiracy and defamation. I wasn't just learning to defend myself, I was learning to dismantle them with the same surgical precision they had used on me. The legal aid clinic provided me with a front-row seat to the failures of the justice system, and I absorbed every lesson, every loophole, and every nuance. I was sharpening my mind into a blade, waiting for the moment to strike. The library's flickering computer screens became my windows back into the life that had betrayed me. One evening, after a double shift that had left my bones aching with a dull, persistent thrum, I sat in a darkened corner of an internet cafe. The air was thick with the scent of old dust and ozone. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I navigated to the hidden cloud server I had established months ago. My fingers, still stained with the ink of 1,000 legal filings, hovered over the keyboard. I entered the password, a date Julian had likely forgotten, the day we had first met, and watched as the interface loaded with an agonizing slowness. The digital gate creaked open. There, listed in chronological order, were the video files from the nanny cam hidden within the vintage teddy bear in Beatrice's sitting room. My hands began to shake, a violent, involuntary tremor that I had to suppress by gripping the edge of the laminate table. I scrolled through the thumbnails until I reached the date of the anniversary. The thumbnail showed the room bathed in the soft, deceptive glow of afternoon sunlight. I clicked play, and the world of the Sterlings flickered to life on the grainy screen. The footage was hauntingly clear. I watched as Beatrice entered the frame, her movements devoid of the frantic panic she had displayed at the dinner table. She walked directly to her safe, her face a mask of calm, calculated intent. I saw her extract the diamond necklace, the very one she would later claim was stolen, and hold it up to the light with a chilling, predatory smile. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a playwright admiring her own script. Then, the door opened, and Julian walked in. I held my breath, waiting for him to stop her, to ask what she was doing. Instead, he approached her with a casual intimacy that made my stomach churn. They didn't speak much, the audio was a low murmur, but their actions spoke with the roar of 1,000 betrayals. I watched as Julian took the necklace from his mother's hand and walked toward the camera, toward the wing of the house where my vanity was located. He moved with a terrifyingly clinical efficiency, a man performing a necessary but mundane task. There was no hesitation, no remorse. He was planting the evidence of my ruin with the same hand that had slipped a wedding ring onto my finger. The video continued, capturing the aftermath of their discovery. I saw them clinking glasses of sherry in the very room where they had just plotted my destruction. Their laughter, though muffled by the teddy bear's plush fabric, felt like a physical assault. The sight of Julian leaning back in his chair, a look of profound relief on his face as he discussed the Isabel transition, was the final, jagged piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a frame-up, it was a liquidation of a human asset. I sat back in the plastic chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The shaking had stopped. In its place was a stillness so absolute it felt like the center of a hurricane. I had the truth, recorded in high definition, stored in a cloud they didn't know existed. I was dead to them, but I held the key to their undoing in the palm of my hand. The preparation was over. The purgatory was beginning to feel like a fortress. I closed the laptop with a soft click, the sound echoing in the quiet cafe like the cocking of a weapon. The flickering blue light of the laptop was the only illumination in my cramped studio, casting distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I sat motionless, a modern-day anchorite in a cathedral of digital ghosts. My eyes were fixed on the screen, rewinding and playing, pausing and zooming, until the pixels themselves seemed to bleed into my consciousness. The footage from the hidden camera was a masterclass in the banality of evil. I watched as Julian and Beatrice, the twin architects of my misery, moved with a leisurely, predatory grace through the sitting room, their masks finally discarded in the supposed safety of their own walls. The audio, captured by the high-sensitivity microphone I had once intended for security, was a low, chilling murmur. As I adjusted the gain, the truth emerged not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow-acting poison. They were not merely discussing the night's successful framing of me, they were reminiscing. I watched as Julian swirled a glass of aged cognac, the amber liquid catching the light with a deceptive warmth. He spoke of my father, a man whose name had been dragged through the mud of a manufactured scandal years ago, a scandal that had broken his heart and left our family estate in a precarious state of legal limbo. The revelation was a jagged blade to my sternum. It hadn't been an unfortunate series of financial mishaps that led to my father's disgrace, it had been an orchestration. Julian and Beatrice discussed the poisoning of his reputation with the clinical detachment of surgeons. They had systematically dismantled his credit, whispered into the ears of his creditors, and painted him as a delusional gambler until the only way to save the family land, the ancestral acreage the Sterlings so desperately coveted for their development projects, was through a strategic alliance. My marriage wasn't a union of hearts, it was a hostile takeover, a long-game heist where the ultimate prize was a deed to soil that had belonged to my lineage for generations. I watched Beatrice laugh, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of her soul. She mocked my father's provincial integrity, a trait she viewed as a fatal flaw. They had used my love for my father and my desire to restore his name as the very tether to pull me into their trap. Every "I love you" Julian had whispered in the dark was a line of code in a fraudulent transaction. I wasn't his wife, I was a legal necessity, a signature they needed to keep until the final transfer of assets was complete. The theft of the jewelry was merely the closing ceremony of their operation, a way to discard the container once the contents had been drained. The realization settled over me with a weight that was both crushing and strangely buoyant. My entire marriage had been a projection of their own internal rot. They called me a thief because they were the ultimate plunderers. They called me a parasite because they had been feeding on my family's legacy for half a decade. Every accusation they had leveled against me was a confession of their own character. For the first time since the storm broke over the Sterling gates, the phantom pain in my chest was replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I was no longer a victim seeking a reprieve, I was a creditor coming to collect a debt that could only be paid in the currency of their absolute ruin. I began to map out the anatomy of my response. It could not be a common brawl, it could not be a messy public scandal that would eventually fade from the memory of the elite. To truly destroy them, I had to use the very tools they had mastered, the law, the social hierarchy, and the delicate art of the elegant execution. I realized that being dead to them was my greatest asset. They believed they had erased me, but in reality, they had only released me from the constraints of their scrutiny. I was now a ghost with a high-speed internet connection and a photographic memory of every fiscal impropriety I had witnessed while managing their household accounts. I spent the remaining hours of the night cross-referencing the dates mentioned in their recorded conversation with the digital ledger of Julian's holding company. The patterns began to emerge: small, surgical withdrawals, offshore transfers disguised as consulting fees, and the systematic bleeding of the land trust that was supposed to be my inheritance. They had been careless in their arrogance, leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs that only someone with my intimate knowledge of their routines could follow. I wasn't just looking for revenge, I was looking for the structural weaknesses in their empire. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the grime of my window, I felt a sense of profound enlightenment. The sterling name was a hollow shell, held together by the collective belief in its permanence. I was the only one who knew how thin the walls truly were. I stood up, my body aching from hours of stillness, but my mind was more vibrant than it had been in years. I walked to the small sink and splashed cold water on my face, looking at the woman in the mirror. She was thinner, paler, and her eyes held a depth of knowledge that made her unrecognizable from the girl in the plum-colored dress. The plan began to assemble itself with the elegance of a chess gambit. I would not approach the police, not yet. The authorities were often just another wing of the sterling influence. Instead, I would become the invisible force that would turn their own greed against them. I would maneuver them into a position where the truth wouldn't just be revealed, it would be unavoidable. I would reclaim my father's land, but more importantly, I would reclaim the narrative of my own life. I was no longer the girl who had been framed. I was the architect of the reckoning that was coming for them, and the foundation of their world was already beginning to tremble. The metamorphosis did not begin with a grand gesture, but with the quiet, surgical excision of everything that tied me to the sterling name. I looked at the woman in the cracked mirror of my studio, a woman who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being a porcelain doll, and I shattered her. I took a pair of shears and shorn my hair into a sharp, severe bob that framed my face like a blade, removing the soft tresses Julian had so often stroked while whispering lies. I discarded the muted pastels and the acceptable silhouettes of a high society wife, replacing them with a wardrobe of charcoal silks and obsidian wool. I was no longer a decorative asset, I was a shadow-taking form. I reclaimed my maiden name, Alara Vance, a name that felt like a long-lost weapon returning to its sheath. My remaining savings, a modest sum I had meticulously tucked away from my premarital life and the small inheritance my father had managed to protect, became the seed for my resurrection. I did not rush to the authorities with my digital evidence. To do so would have been to play by a set of rules that Julian already owned. Justice in his world was a commodity, and I was not yet wealthy enough to buy it. Instead, I established Astria Strategic, a consulting firm veiled behind a complex web of shell companies and offshore registrations. I operated from the periphery, using the legal aid clinic's resources and my own intimate knowledge of Julian's fiscal architecture to build a ghost in the machine. I was the invisible hand, moving pieces on a board he didn't even realize had been set. My strategy was born of a cold, mathematical patience. During my years at the Sterling estate, I had been more than a hostess, I had been the silent auditor of Julian's life. I knew the cadence of his company's breathing. I knew that Sterling Global Holdings was an edifice built on the shaky foundation of over-leveraged debt and aggressive, ego-driven expansion. Julian operated on the assumption of perpetual growth, fueled by the very land deeds he had stolen from my family. I began to track the distressed notes of his subsidiaries, the high-interest loans he had taken to finance his latest vanity projects. Quietly, through a series of anonymous acquisitions, Astria began to buy up his debt. I wasn't just a creditor, I was becoming the silent landlord of his ambitions. The irony was a bitter, exquisite wine. The very system of financial predation they had used to dismantle my father's life was now the instrument of their own entrapment. Each time Julian's company required a bridge loan or a debt restructuring to keep the facade from crumbling, it was my signature, disguised and distant, that authorized the terms. I watched from my dim studio as his corporate reports began to show the first signs of stress, a subtle hemorrhaging that only a specialist could detect. He was unaware that the unnamed institutional investor tightening the noose around his neck was the woman he had cast out into the rain with a single suitcase. I was the ghost in his balance sheet, the specter in his spreadsheets. Being dead to high society was an intoxicating freedom. While Beatrice and Julian were occupied with the social debut of Isabel, my replacement, a woman whose pedigree was as flawless as her lack of intuition, I was a cipher. I walked the same streets they did, sometimes sitting in the back of the same upscale coffee shops, shielded by my new, austere identity and the invisibility that poverty or perceived failure provides in their world. I watched them through the glass, noting the slight tremor in Julian's hands as he checked his phone, the way Beatrice's laugh sounded increasingly brittle. They were beginning to feel the pressure of the invisible creditor, the tightening of a leash they couldn't see. My work at the legal aid clinic provided the final piece of the puzzle. I spent my nights cross-referencing the land deeds they had seized from my father with the zoning laws of the upcoming municipal developments. I discovered that Julian had bypassed several environmental regulations to accelerate his construction timelines, a gamble that would be fatal if brought to light at the right moment. I didn't just want to take his money, I wanted to take the ground from beneath his feet. I wanted him to experience the vertigo of realizing that everything he owned was a loan that was now being called in. The internal transformation was the most profound. The Alara who sought validation from a cold husband was gone, replaced by a woman who found solace in the cold precision of a well-executed plan. I found a strange, monastic joy in my meager surroundings. The cramped studio was no longer a prison, it was a laboratory. The 2 jobs were no longer a burden, they were my cover. I realized that the Sterlings had never truly seen me because they never truly saw anyone they considered beneath them. Their arrogance was their blind spot, a vast, yawning chasm into which I was preparing to push their entire legacy. As the months bled into a year, Astria Strategic grew into a silent behemoth. I held enough of Julian's debt to dictate his company's future, should I choose to exercise my rights. But I was not ready to end the game yet. I wanted the reveal to be a masterpiece of public and private agony. I wanted to wait until the moment of their greatest triumph, the upcoming Sterling Charity Gala, the pinnacle of the social calendar, to present my bill. I was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. I was the architect of a reckoning, meticulously placing the charges at the structural pillars of their lives, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the match. The silence of my apartment was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of a predator in wait. I looked at the digital folder containing the CCTV footage, the land deeds, and the debt acquisitions. It was a complete dossier of their destruction. Julian believed he had won when he locked that door on the night of the storm. He didn't realize that by throwing me out, he had simply moved me to a position where I could finally see the whole board. The long game was reaching its endgame, and I was the only player who knew that the king was already in check. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan was a cavern of shimmering deceit, a monument to the very architecture of ego that the Sterling family had spent generations perfecting. Under the weight of 1,000 crystal prisms, the air was a thick slurry of vintage champagne, expensive perfumes, and the pheromones of old money. Tonight was the Sterling Charity Gala, the zenith of the social calendar, where Julian and Beatrice performed their roles as paragons of philanthropy. Julian stood at the center of the room, a glass of crystal-clear gin in his hand, looking every bit the conquering hero of industry. Beside him, Isabel, dripping in the very diamonds that had once been used to brand me a criminal, offered the room a smile of practiced, porcelain perfection. They were the guests of honor, the golden couple of a world that had collectively decided to forget my existence. I stood at the threshold of the ballroom, a shadow forged in the fires of 1,000 sleepless nights. My re-entry was not a desperate crash into their sanctuary, but a measured, rhythmic advance. I had shed the plum-colored vulnerability of my past life like a brittle skin. In its place was a gown of liquid obsidian that moved like oil over water, its high collar framing my face with a severe, architectural elegance. My hair, once long and inviting, was now a sharp, obsidian bob that offered no handhold. I was no longer a decorative asset to be discarded, I was a predator who had learned to walk in the light without blinking. The silence that accompanied my walk across the marble floor was not instantaneous, but cumulative. It began as a ripple at the periphery and surged into a seismic wave of hushed whispers and clinking glasses being lowered. I saw the recognition bloom on the faces of the socialites, the women who had snubbed me, the men who had looked through me. But the recognition was immediately clouded by confusion. I didn't look like a disgraced thief, I looked like the owner of the room. I was accompanied by a phalanx of legal counsel and executive assistants, the visible armor of Astria Strategic. Julian was the last to see me. He was mid-laugh, leaning into Isabel's ear, when the atmospheric pressure of the room shifted. When his eyes finally met mine, the color drained from his face with a suddenness that was almost surgical. The polished, aristocratic mask he wore didn't just crack, it dissolved, revealing the hollow, panicked boy beneath. Beatrice, standing nearby, dropped her flute of champagne. The sound of glass shattering against the marble was the only music I needed. It was a percussion of truth in a room full of choreographed lies. I moved toward them with a grace that felt like a haunting. Every step was a reclamation of the space they thought they had stolen from me. Julian's hands began to tremor, the gin in his glass vibrating in a frantic, rhythmic dance. He tried to speak, to muster the indignation of a man who had successfully buried his past, but his voice was a strangled ghost. Isabel, sensing the shift but lacking the context of our shared trauma, tightened her grip on his arm, her eyes darting between us with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning fear. She was the new queen, but she was standing on ground that I had already begun to excavate. I stopped precisely 3 feet from them, the distance of an executioner's strike. I did not wait for a greeting. I did not acknowledge the gasps of the crowd. I simply looked at Julian with a gaze so cold and clinical it seemed to freeze the sweat on his brow. I offered a smile, a thin, lethal line that did not reach my eyes. It was a smile that drew blood before the first word was spoken. I introduced myself not as the wife he had framed, but as the chief executive officer of the firm that had spent the last year quietly absorbing his failures. The revelation of my position as the head of Astria Strategic was a physical blow to them. But I wasn't finished. With a flick of my wrist, my assistant handed me a sleek, silver-edged envelope. I held it out to Julian, the paper catching the light like a blade. I spoke in a voice that was a low, melodic vibration, devoid of the frantic emotion they expected. I told them that as the new primary creditor of Sterling Global, I had recently taken the liberty of reviewing their personal assets. I informed them, with a touch of dry, elegant wit, that Astria now held the master lease to the Sterling mansion, the very house where they had staged my ruin. They were no longer the masters of their domain, they were tenants of my mercy. The interaction was a study in absolute power. Julian's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air in a world that had suddenly turned to vacuum. Beatrice's face was a mask of distorted fury, her eyes wide with the realization that the lowborn parasite had returned as the owner of her sanctuary. I watched the realization sink into their bones, the understanding that their every move for the past year had been monitored, facilitated, and eventually owned by the woman they thought they had destroyed. I was the invisible hand that had fed them the rope, and tonight, I was beginning to pull. I turned my attention to Isabel, whose diamonds seemed to dull in my presence. I offered her the envelope as a gift to celebrate their upcoming nuptials. It wasn't a card, it was a formal notice of intent. I suggested that they might want to begin looking for a new residence, as the aesthetic of the Sterling estate was due for a total cleansing. The cruelty was refined, wrapped in the language of corporate restructuring and social grace. I was using their own weapons, status, wealth, and legal maneuvers, to dismantle the very foundation of their pride. As I turned to leave, the crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I felt the heat of 1,000 stares, but I was insulated by the cold clarity of my purpose. The gala continued around us, but the music sounded like a dirge. I had not just returned to their world, I had overwritten it. The shockwaves I had sent through the Sterling camp were only the beginning. They had believed that by taking my phone and my keys, they had taken my power. They had forgotten that my power was never in the objects I possessed, but in the mind they had so foolishly underestimated. I walked out of the ballroom, the scent of their fear lingering in my wake like a fine perfume. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling opulence of the Metropolitan. I looked at the city skyline, the lights reflecting in my eyes with a predatory brilliance. I had reclaimed my name, I had reclaimed my power, and I had effectively evicted them from their own lives. But the most exquisite part of the reckoning was still to come. The gift I had given Julian was merely a preview. The real revelation, the digital ghost I had carried with me for a year, was waiting for its final, public debut. The ballroom had become a cathedral of expectant silence, the air vibrating with the collective held breath of the city's elite. I moved toward the central podium with a deliberate, haunting slow-motion grace, my obsidian gown trailing behind me like a shadow that had finally learned to lead. Julian stood frozen near the front of the stage, his face a calcified mask of panic, his hand white-knuckled around a crystal glass that appeared as fragile as his reputation. Beside him, Beatrice was a statue of indignant marble, her eyes burning with a desperate, silent command for me to vanish. But I was the only light in the room now, the singular point of gravity toward which every gaze was inexorably drawn. I did not speak into the microphone to launch an accusation. Instead, I offered a simple, elegant nod to the tech booth, a silent signal to commence the final movement of my symphony. The massive, floor-to-ceiling LED screens that had previously displayed the Sterling family's philanthropic milestones flickered and hummed to life. A haunting, minor-key arrangement of our wedding march began to bleed through the surround sound speakers, a low, cello-heavy vibration that felt like a funeral dirge for a living lie. The screen bloomed with images of our wedding 5 years ago. There was the gilded couple, Julian, looking every bit the dashing savior, and me, the wide-eyed girl in a cloud of white lace, looking at him with a devotion that now seemed like a foreign language. The guests watched, some whispering that this was a desperate attempt at a sentimental reconciliation. But the pacing of the photos began to quicken, the music growing more dissonant, more jagged. The smiles on screen started to feel like the baring of teeth. Then, with a sudden, sharp digital snap, the color drained from the world. The high-definition infrared footage of Beatrice's private sitting room erupted onto the screens, visceral and undeniable. The ballroom gasped as one, a collective intake of air that sounded like a collapsing lung. There, in the grainy, crystalline clarity of the nanny cam, was the truth. The footage didn't just show the theft, it showed the theater of it. The guests watched in horrific fascination as Beatrice calmly extracted the diamond necklace from her own safe and handed it to Julian with a wink that felt like a physical violation. The audio was the true executioner. The high-sensitivity microphones had captured every syllable of their calculated malice. Julian's voice, amplified to a godlike roar through the ballroom's sound system, echoed with a chilling, clinical arrogance. He didn't just discuss the necklace, he spoke of my father. He detailed the poisoning of the Vance name, the manufactured scandals, and the strategic financial strangulation that had forced me into his arms. He called me a transactional necessity, a means to an end for the land deeds that sat beneath his corporate empire. He laughed, a cold, metallic sound, at the thought of me rotting in a cell while he moved Isabel into my bed. The downfall was visceral. Julian's glass finally shattered against the marble, the shards glinting like the diamonds he had used to frame me. He looked at the screen, then at the crowd, and finally at me. For the first time, he saw the architect, not the victim. Beatrice's hands flew to her throat, her fingers clawing at the pearls that now felt like a noose. The socialites who had once clinked glasses with them recoiled as if the Sterlings were suddenly contagious, their faces twisting from morbid curiosity to a sharp, aristocratic disgust. The foundation of their world, the Sterling name, was being pulverized in real time by the weight of their own recorded iniquity. As the video reached its crescendo, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. This time, the intrusion was not a choreographed lie. A phalanx of officers in dark uniforms entered the golden light, their presence a stark, industrial contrast to the evening's opulence. They did not move toward me. They bypassed the thief and moved with rhythmic, inevitable precision toward the guests of honor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the mechanical click of handcuffs, a sound that resonated with a poetic justice more profound than any speech I could have given. Julian was led away first, his head bowed, the shadow of the giant screen still projecting the image of his own betrayal onto his back. Beatrice followed, her screams of lowborn and lies falling on deaf ears, her dignity trailing behind her like the remnants of a shredded silk veil. I stood on the podium, untouched and unbothered, watching the debris of my marriage being cleared away. The gift I had given them was not just the loss of their freedom, but the absolute, public revelation of their souls. I looked at the crowd, the same people who had stood by and watched my ruin a year ago, and I saw the dawn of a new era. I was the one who held the leases, the debt, and the truth. The elegant execution was complete. The room was mine, the name was mine, and for the first time in 5 years, the air I breathed was entirely my own. The visiting room of the state penitentiary was a study in monochromatic despair, a sterile box of cinder blocks and fluorescent hum that stripped away the illusions of rank and lineage. The air tasted of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of institutional anxiety. I sat behind the scratched plexiglass, wearing a suit of ivory linen that felt like a crisp, defiant armor against the sallow grayness of the room. Across from me, the man who had once been the sun of my universe was now a shrunken, disheveled moon. Julian's designer silk had been replaced by a coarse, orange jumpsuit that made his skin look like parchment. The sharp, aristocratic lines of his face had softened into a blur of frantic, unmoored desperation. He did not speak at first, he merely pressed his palms against the glass, his fingers trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic fragility. When he finally found his voice, it was not the commanding baritone of a CEO, but a thin, cloying whine that scraped against the silence. He wept, the tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. He spoke of misunderstandings and the pressure of legacy, eventually devolving into a frantic, stuttering confession of a love he claimed had never truly died. He begged for mercy, for a softening of the legal testimony that was currently dismantling his mother's sanity and his own future. He told me he loved me, a phrase that had once been my oxygen but now felt like a toxic gas. I looked at him, and for the first time in 5 years, the ghost of the woman I used to be didn't ache. I didn't feel the searing heat of rage or the jagged edges of betrayal. Instead, I felt a profound, echoing pity, the kind one feels for a small, trapped creature that doesn't understand the mechanics of its own cage. I realized that Julian had never been a titan, he was a hollow vessel filled with the expectations of a dead father and a monstrous mother. He was small. His cruelty hadn't been an act of power, but a frantic attempt to hide his own insignificance. My silence was not a weapon, but a reflection of his own emptiness. I got up from the stool without a word, leaving his pleas to echo against the glass, a soundtrack to a life that had finally run out of lies. The liquidation of the Sterling estate was a surgical procedure, a necessary amputation of a diseased history. I watched as the mahogany furniture, the predatory art, and the thousands of crystal prisms were carted away by men with clipboards and indifferent expressions. The mansion, once a cathedral of my own making, now felt like an ossuary, a place where the bones of my past were finally being laid to rest. When the final deed was signed and the keys were handed over to the new developers, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt the lightness of ash being caught by the wind. The proceeds from the sale, a fortune built on the stolen land of my family and the exploited labor of Julian's subsidiaries, were not something I wanted to keep. To hold on to that wealth would have been to remain a tenant in their house of horrors. I funneled the entirety of the Sterling liquidation into the Vance Foundation, establishing a network of sanctuaries for women who had been broken by the same refined, domestic psychological warfare I had survived. I wanted the walls that had once sheltered my abusers to become the foundation for 1,000 resurrections. I was turning their gilded cage into a bridge for others to cross into the light. A month later, I stood on a balcony in a small coastal town, leagues away from the smog and the stratified cruelty of the city. The Mediterranean stretched out before me like a vast, azure scroll, its rhythmic pulse a soothing counterpoint to the chaotic static of my previous life. The air here didn't smell like lilies and metal, it smelled of salt, pine, and the terrifying, beautiful scent of infinity. I leaned against the railing, the sun warming my skin, and closed my eyes. The silence was no longer a threat, it was a conversation with myself. I realized then that the Sterlings had tried to bury me, forgetting that I was a seed. They had intended the theft of the necklace to be my end, but it had been the catalyst for my beginning. I hadn't just survived a scandal or executed a revenge, I had performed a radical act of self-reclamation. I had found the woman I was meant to be, the Alara who existed before the plum-colored dresses and the whispered apologies. The woman who stood on the balcony was not a victim of a crime, nor was she merely a victor of a game. She was a woman who had built her own soul from the wreckage of a house of cards. The fire of the reckoning had burned everything away, the lies, the marriage, the Sterling name, until only the essential remained. I looked at my hands, no longer ink-stained or calloused, but steady in mine. I was unburdened, a ghost who had finally earned her flesh. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the waves in strokes of gold and violet, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, unadulterated air of a future I had authored with my own hands. I was Alara Vance, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. They tried to bury her, but they didn't know she was a seed. Alara's journey is a reminder that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. What was your favorite moment of her reckoning? I read every comment and cherish the wisdom you share. I am deeply grateful for your support and for letting me share this story with you. If you believe in the power of an elegant comeback and the beauty of a woman standing in her own light, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Your presence here makes this channel a sanctuary for us all.